So introducing Dr. Urmila Anand, is a senior consultant nephrologist and head of Department of Nephrology at Yashoda Hospital, Secunderabad. Dr. Urmila did her medicine at Pondicherry, her medicine M.Med at All India Institute of Medical Sciences in Delhi, one of the #1 center in the country, and nephrology again at the Christian Medical College, Vellore, which is another lead center in India. Dr. Urmila did her fellowship, ISN fellowship at Bristol, UK, and another peritoneal dialysis fellowship of the international of the ISPD at Toronto, Canada. Dr. Urmila was the best outgoing undergraduate student at the Madras University, and is part of the ISN, very active part of the ISN, the Southwestern Asian region. And over to you, Urmila. I mean, I'm not going to go too much in detail more. There's so much to read.
No, thank you. Thank you. Good evening, colleagues. First of all, a very happy new year. And when Lloyd asked me to say a few words about diabetic kidney disease in state-of-the-art therapy, I realized there is a lot more to be discussed. So what I will do is I will only discuss diabetic kidney disease, the conservative management, will not discuss the renal replacement therapy part of it, because there is a lot more information now about how do we treat diabetic kidney disease. Now, if you look into this slide, this is actually a slide of about published this year in Diabetes Care about the changes in the demographics of diabetic kidney disease worldwide from 2000 to 2015. The data from Africa is actually an estimated data about people who actually went on to maintenance hemodialysis or peritoneal dialysis program. If you look that area, the African area, if you look at 2000, most of it was light pink or mildly pink. Now it is dark red. So the incidence of diabetic end-stage kidney is rapidly rising in Africa, and in various parts, it's almost more than 2,000 per million population. And over the next few years, in the next 20 years and 15 years, the world's diabetic population is supposed to increase from 386 million to about almost 600 million, and which Africa, the rate of increase in Africa will it will double in this next 15 years, because the rate of rise is about 93%, one of the highest in the world, much higher than the diabetic capitals of the world, that is Southeast Asia. So I think the importance is for all of us to understand that countries in Africa which were untouched by diabetes are actually now getting ravaged by this communicable disease. I start with a case. Most of my presentation will be with a single case, and I'm sure most of you will have this similar case in your practice. This is a young gentleman who was type 2 diabetes, hypertension, who was on irregular treatment, who presented to us with swelling in legs, breathlessness, worsening hypertension. Found to have a blood pressure of about 145/94. He had pallor, with mild periorbital puffiness, mild edema, chest showed no RALs. Fundus showed mild non-proliferative retinopathy, and he's a smoker. The diagnosis, clinical presentation and clinical diagnosis is diabetic kidney disease. And in earlier days, because of his retinopathy, we would consider this is a diabetic nephropathy patient. His parameters, laboratory, the basic parameters showed an hemoglobin of 10.3, slightly uncontrolled diabetes, for fasting 148 and a ppbs of 223. Renal failure with a creatinine of 1.8, which roughly translates to about 160, 170 micromoles per liter, mildly hyperkalemic, high uric acid, and a high urinary microalbumin. Chest X-ray showed cardiomegaly, LVH, an impact of the result of his uncontrolled hypertension, and an ejection fraction of 45%. There was no RW, regional wall motion abnormality, which you can say that he may not have significant coronary artery disease. Lipid profiles were bad, cholesterol uncontrolled, even LDL was on the higher level. Ultrasound showed normal size kidney and did not have significant post-void residue. Now this patient was actually, he was not on any medicine, and his regular practitioner started him on amlodipine. Metformin was continued for 500 milligram twice a day. Rosuvastatin was given. He was on vitamin B complex. He says that he is aware of dietary restrictions in kidney patients, but finds it difficult and usually does not comply with all those restrictions. Now, this is a patient, and even before we go into the therapy or the pharmacological aspect of diabetic kidney disease, it is understood and it is important for us to understand that we have to educate this patient about diabetic related knowledge, beliefs, and skills. He should be able to manage his disease and should be motivated enough to control his, monitor his sugars and modify his medications as appropriate. And there's nothing we do in diabetes unless we have healthy lifestyles, and look into the various risk factors, mostly the macro and the microvascular risk factors. We need to make him understand that the control of his diabetes is actually to prevent these complications in the future. And he should be able to monitor and understand the complications of his medications. It's important because he is now developing renal failure. His blood sugar control will be difficult and he may develop worsening hypoglycemia. And he should also understand what are the complications he's looking for, how to monitor them, and how to take care. And most important, there are a lot of studies, especially from India, that almost 30% of diabetic patients are depressed. And hence, it's important that we emphasize on his emotional and mental well-being besides the drugs we will be discussing in the future. So when we think of diabetic kidney disease as nephrologists, what are our goals? The first and most important is to diagnose diabetic kidney disease as early as possible, and if possible, prevent. There was a study in Lancet about perindopril as a primary prevention, but this has not gone beyond that as a primary prevention of diabetic kidney disease. Next is to do all that is possible for us to prevent or retard the progression of diabetic kidney disease. And we have exciting new drugs now. Treat factors which are responsible for progression, not to forget is dietary compliance, hypertension, and also modify other comorbidities which has indirect link on his progression. Now, when we treat diabetes, this is a pyramid where all patients will need to have a good glycemic control, good blood pressure control, a good cholesterol management. Smoking has to be stopped to reduce his atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease comorbidity, nutrition, salt restriction, and various other appropriate diet and healthy exercise. Now, this is a KDIGO recommendation that the next group of patients should be considered, and most of them should be offered RAS blockade. And now in current scenario, with all the last 3-4 years of our knowledge, SGLT2 inhibitors. I'm aware these drugs are even not available in the United States that freely, and if available, they're quite expensive. But in our country, because some of these drugs has come over out of the patent, drugs are becoming cheaper. And finally, some patients may need, depending on their cardiovascular risk profile, antiplatelet agents. It is also very important to understand that diabetic kidney disease is just not diabetic nephropathy. The progression of diabetic kidney disease also is somehow manifested by repeated episodes of acute kidney injury. And most importantly, this happens because of hemodynamics. Either we overtreat their hypertension or increase their RAS blockade. So they develop repeated hypotension and lead into AKIs. This repeated insults worsen their chronic kidney disease. The comorbid renal disease, many of them in our country, almost 50% of them have other diseases along with their diabetic kidney disease, like we call them non-diabetic renal disease. We should be aware of them and we should be able to treat them. Vascular disease, especially peripheral vascular disease and ischemic renal disease in the form of atherosclerotic renal disease will worsen the kidney function unless we take care of them. Many studies have shown that high uric acid levels impacts the overall progression, but when I go into the later stage, this may not be true with whatever knowledge, with our current knowledge. Diabetics are systemically and locally inflamed. Mostly they have latent infections, foot infections, various other forms of infections, diabetic foot. These also worsens their diabetic kidney injury. So this is important. We just not think of the drugs and glycemic control and RAS blockade, but continuously look for other insults which can worsen the kidney damage. And the various drugs that we use with them, sometimes even native medications, can worsen their tubular interstitial injury. very common in our country, leading to worsening diabetic kidney disease. This is what we were taught, the cornerstone of therapy in diabetic kidney disease. This is Mogensen's natural history, which starts with microalbuminuria, goes to macro, then progressive GFR decline and ESKD. In most stages, the most important component as a nephrologist has been this, blood pressure control along with RAS inhibitors. And we used to leave the sugar control to the endocrinologist. But with the current knowledge and understanding, in fact, nephrologists should also take responsibility of the glycemic control, because these drugs which are now available with us are actually not only good in controlling sugars, but very good in inhibiting progression of kidney disease and cardiovascular complications. So the therapies, there are various pathways to discuss about how do we manage. I'm not going into the pathogenesis, but from a nephrology point of view, the moment your patient comes to you with proteinuria, the first thing that you think, we need to control the proteinuria to retard its progression, which is true. And we have a set of drugs, and the commonest group of drugs that we used to use was RAS blockade. But now over a period of time, there are newer drugs which are coming in, which like MRAs, which also can be considered as a part of renin-angiotensin aldosterone system blockade, and endothelin antagonists, which can also help us in retard progression. Important to understand, if the patient does not and cannot tolerate RAS, then there are other antihypertensives which can reduce the intraglomerular pressure and improve albuminuria. Whole lot of studies in earlier days, starting from 1998, UKPDS to studies which have shown that if you adequately use drugs to block the renin-angiotensin aldosterone system, you achieve renoprotection. There have been many, many studies which has been used, but what is important for us to understand that it is just not the use of ACE inhibitors or angiotensin receptor blockers. The RAS blockade and its pathway is amenable to various other pharmacological interventions. There are drugs which are coming in from ACE2 activators, which also lead to renoprotection. There are various inflammatory pathway antagonists. There are angiotensin 2 receptor AT2 agonists, which also can help, and MRAs, the mineralocorticoid receptor antagonists, which are now in clinical practice. So besides ACE inhibitors, ARBs, MRAs are in our armamentarium to get some amount of RAS blockade. DRIs, the direct renin inhibitors, was used to a certain extent, but now aliskiren was a drug, but which is not used anymore because of its side effects. Now, how do you optimize RAS blockade? It is not just important to write in your prescription either enalapril or losartan. It is very important that one of the major use of RAS blockade is to use the maximum dose of the drug. No point getting 50% or 25% of the drug. And you can stepwise increase the drug, and if there are not much side effects, you need to go to the maximum possible use of these drugs. Second component is, unless you restrict the salt, RAS blockade is going to be ineffective. So this patient should be told about sodium restriction. And there are studies which I'll go into it, is that if your RAS blockade is hindered by hyperkalemia, then you use drugs which reduces the potassium, but still continue with your RAS blockade. This unfortunately increases the pill burden and becomes a little more expensive in our part of the world. But then there are parts of the world where the combination of an anti-hyperkalemic agent and high dose RAS blockade is being considered in patients who have tendency to hyperkalemia. Now, the important things that we need to start is the use of RAS blockade, and the recommendation of KDIGO. The current recommendation in EKD is that we start treatment with angiotensin converting enzyme or angiotensin receptor blocker in patients with diabetes, hypertension, and albuminuria. And these medicines should be titrated to the highest approved dose. When you start with ACE inhibitors and ARBs, we need to monitor the creatinine and potassium. And if the patient is normokalemic and there is less than 30% increase in the creatinine, which is a physiological effect of the drug, we should slowly increase the dose to continue and to go into the maximum tolerated dose. If the patient has hyperkalemia, look into the other drugs which can cause hyperkalemia, control dietary restrictions, and like use the potassium intake, use diuretics, which may benefit in your salt excretion, and also improve the drug efficacy of ACE inhibitors. And finally, you may add sodium cation exchanges, the resins. Sodium bicarbonate in later stages of kidney disease also helps us in controlling the hypertension. If the creatinine rises more than 30%, look for other causes of acute kidney injury. If the patient is volume depleted or has hypertension, correct that. Look into other drugs which can create problems, and even look for renal artery stenosis. And in these situations, if things don't work out and if there are problems, we need to reduce the ACE and ARBs. This is common clinical practice. This is just for us to re-emphasize this, and I think most of us do this. The other drug which has come to us is this finerenone. This is a non-steroidal mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist. This has just been published last year in NEJM in October 23rd, 2020. This is a drug which is a randomized double-blind trial where they have looked into the use of these drugs, and they have used up to GFR of 25. So they have included chronic kidney disease patients also, and with proteinuria of less than 300, low protein. And the study has shown that there is some amount of, in patients with finerenone, almost 20%, 14 to 18% reduction in both primary composite outcomes of kidney failure and cardiovascular death. So these drugs can be also used in our patients if you have the drug available to us. Now, this is the studies which came to 5 years ago, where these two antihyperkalemic agents, patiromer and sodium zirconium cyclosilicate, and there are studies which we look into where it has been shown that the use of these drugs actually helps you to optimize your RAS blockade. This has been done not in diabetic kidney disease, but a part of this study also had chronic kidney disease patients with diabetes. This is the AMBER study, came out in Lancet in 2019 from Rajiv Agarwal, where they used patiromer versus placebo to help or enable the use of spironolactone in patients with resistant hypertension and chronic kidney disease. And here also, the risk reduction of hyperkalemia was quite a bit with this drug, the use of patiromer. So in patients with resistant hypertension and chronic kidney disease, patiromer enabled more patients to continue treatment with spironolactone with less hyperkalemia. But obviously, patiromer does not have any antihypertensive effect. But use of spironolactone or eplerenone with its cardiovascular efficacy may be considered along with patiromer, but as again, extra drugs. Endothelin antagonists have been come in picture, and they have come and gone. I have been part of a trial called Bosentan, was withdrawn because of its fluid retention in diabetic kidney disease. Now, what we have is this study, the SONA study, which was presented in World Congress of Nephrology last year, 2019, actually, it's almost 2 years back, where they used the endothelin antagonist atrasentan to improving diabetic nephropathy. The drug is not as good as the next group of drugs which I will be talking, but it has also shown benefits in improving end-stage renal disease, doubling of serum creatinine, cardiovascular death, and hospitalization because of heart failure. So the interpretation of this study is that atrasentan reduces the risk of renal events in selected patients with diabetic nephropathy who are at a high risk of developing end-stage renal disease. In patients whom you cannot use RAS blockade, but you still need to have hypertension control and antiproteinuric effect, consider these drugs: beta blockers, calcium channel antagonists, except nifedipine, all have some negative or reducing effects on proteinuria. So beta blockers, they are also part of the RAS blockade because of their sympathetic activities, and non-nifedipine calcium channel blockers can also be used. Prazosin, that is alpha antagonist, improve your insulin resistance, and to a certain extent, they also reduce albuminuria. Now we come to the most important part. For a nephrologist, it's always been hypertension control, proteinuria control in retarding DKD. But I think as of now, we all should become responsible for taking care of the sugar control. Now, what is important for us to understand that we should establish early tight glycemic control. It is important to understand we should not be afraid of hypoglycemia with the newer drugs, which are beneficial in such situation, because there is a thing called epigenetic mechanisms like metabolic memory and legacy effect. If the sugar control is not established early, there are non-epigenetic changes which happen in the DNA, which gets methylated, or the histone gets modified, resulting in various forms of microRNAs. And this changes sometimes are persistent. So this persistent pathological changes in the genes does not resolve and leads to organ damage in patients even when you try to control sugars later. This is called the metabolic memory and legacy effect. But then does it mean that it is always too late to control sugars in patients with diabetic nephropathy? It's actually no. If you control glycemic, if you control the sugars even at a later date, moving from HbA1c as high as 9.3 to 8.7, that there is a significant risk of development of end-stage kidney disease from 42% to 29%. This shows that even at a later stage, when patients with a reducing GFR, with a very high HbA1c, we should still try to get some sugar control. And this has been shown, like this patient on the blue line, who has always maintained a HbA1c of 8, has a GFR maintained 12 years to almost about 50 ml per minute. But a patient who has not done anything and his HbA1c stays 10, achieves a GFR of less than 15 in 12 years. But even after 3 or 4 years of a HbA1c of 10, the green line, if your doctor or if we try to get the HbA1c to a line closer to 8, this patient does not attain ASRD and still has a lot of GFR saved because of his sugar control. So even later stages, if you start controlling the sugar, you still achieve a lot of benefits as far as development of ESKD. Now, there is a lot of literature to show that anti-hyperglycemic agents are also renoprotective. UKPDS, Advance, Accord, all these studies have shown just by controlling sugars, you achieve a lot of good salutary effect on the renal endpoints. Now, is it important that we need to control sugars? Yes, various studies have shown that intensive control is good and it offers renoprotection, but in groups of patients, which I will be discussing a little later, a very tight control actually increases their cardiovascular risk and mortality. So who are these patients whom we, and what is the target HbA1c? I will be discussing in the next few slides. So in patients, this is KDIGO DKD guidelines. They says that the way to control your sugars in patients is best done with HbA1c. And done twice a year is good enough, except in patients who are not achieving control, you may do it every 3 months. Now, you need to understand that HbA1c gets modified by hemoglobin and blood glucose and worsening creatinine. So it sometimes gives you a lower level if you have anemic, if you have received blood transfusion in the last 4 or 6 weeks on erythropoiesis stimulating erythropoietin or iron supplements. So you get a falsely low HbA1c. And in patients who have persistent metabolic acidosis, the bias is high. You get a higher HbA1c. So as your chronic kidney disease progresses, the HbA1c becomes less reliable. And in that situation, you may just monitor your blood glucose levels in our patients. Now, this is the question that we had asked is, which are the situations where we need to maintain a tight control of sugar, that is a target of less than 6.5, or in whom, which are the patients where we want to be a little more relaxed. A patient early stage of chronic kidney disease has very minimal cardiovascular complications, no comorbidities or few comorbidities, has a longer life expectancy, does not have autonomic neuropathy and is aware when he becomes hypoglycemic, and has close to a hospital or healthcare facility where he can monitor and manage his hypoglycemia, and he knows how to treat his hypoglycemia. These are the groups you have a tight control. And anything other than this, you may be a little more relaxed in your patients and give them a little, the control target should be a little less tighter. Now, we all advise that most patients, especially our DKD patients, should monitor their sugars. The most important that we have in our country is a self-monitoring of blood glucose with those finger stick capillary glucose using glucometers. And this is done intermittently. So sometimes in our patients, especially with autonomic neuropathy and advanced to chronic kidney disease, you may not pick up the fluctuations in sugars. Nowadays, we have something called continuous glucose monitoring. You can do retrospectively because the sugars may not be visible to you online, but you can even look into the reports at a given time and generate a report. Then you have the real-time continuous glucose monitoring. You connect a sensor and the data is completely displayed regularly throughout the day. So the patient can review as and when he wants his glucose levels and adjust his treatment. The other is intermittently. There is a sensor attached to your skin and you can use a scanner whenever you wish to if you are symptomatic and get your sugars monitoring. These continuous glucose monitors are like ABPM, and they give you the percentage of time when the patient is in range or when he is, which is the time when he is out of range, and it helps to a certain extent for his monitoring of his anti-hyperglycemic medicines. We don't have this in India. Some of it is available in Bangalore as a part of trials now. Now, what are the drugs that we have as nephrologists? I divide them because as a nephrologist, we look into the drugs which have high risk of hypoglycemia to compare to drugs which have low risk of hypoglycemia. Because of our concern of hypoglycemia, we actually prefer this group of drugs, that is metformin, SGLT2 inhibitors, GLP-1 receptor agonists, and DP4 inhibitors. These are the drugs which we are commonly using in our group of patients. The earlier concept when we were students that all chronic kidney disease patients should be on insulin and avoid sulfonylureas, I think is slowly getting out because with this, though these drugs don't add up to much of hyperglycemic effect, anti-hyperglycemic effect, glucose lowering effect, but in combinations, they are quite good. So metformin, this patient who has a chronic kidney disease, should we be continuing metformin? I think yes, his GFR is not less than 45. So he can be continued with metformin. If a patient comes to you whose GFR is less than 30, don't start metformin, or if he is on metformin, stop it. But if his GFR is more than 60 or even up to 45, you can start and continue his metformin either as a form of immediate release or extended release. That is your choice. A patient with GFR of 30 to 44, you can continue the metformin if he is on, and you can cut the dose into half the dose and titrate it to as much as possible without side effects. Monitor the vitamin B12 levels because these patients develop vitamin B12 deficiency, and always monitor his kidney function. GFR more than 60 annually, and the other CKD stage 4, 3A, 3B, and 4 every 3 to 6 months. If GFR stays stable, continue. If the GFR stays stable, continue the dose if there is any problems. And if the GFR still take half the dose. And depending on the decline in GFR, you can modify the dose. Now, if your patient, this patient of ours does not have blood sugar control optimum. Now, what do we do with him? Actually, we should get him to the optimum dose of his metformin. He is only on 1 gram. We can go up to 2 grams. And if we cannot do that, then comes the second group of drugs, that is the SGLT2 inhibitors. And the first question you have to ask, is this drug safe in your patient? There are adverse effects in these drugs, which we should be aware. And if we cannot do that, then we don't use that, and then we try thinking of other drugs. But if this patient can be safely considered to start SGLT2 as the second drug, we should add this group of drugs. We call them colloquially flozins, and there is a word coming as flozinating these patients, and we start look into the adverse effects, follow and modify the dose accordingly. So I now come to this group of drugs which have been shown to have benefits far beyond its sugar control. That is the sodium glucose transporter 2 inhibitors and the incretin-based therapies. That includes DPP4, dipeptide peptidase inhibitors, and GLP-1 agonists. So I go into it, and if you look into it, if you look from 2013 to 2020, These pink ones are the SGLT2 inhibitor trials. The blue ones are the DPP4 trials. And this orange ones are the GLP-1. Look at the profusion of trials on SGLT2 inhibitors. And look the number of trials that we have in the last 2 years on SGLT2 inhibitors. They have made a lot of difference in our treatment. And similarly, even with the GLP-1, and newer studies are coming on in the renoprotection of these group of drugs also. And these are the basic trials, which I think all of us are aware of it, which have been used. And I briefly have, this is a slide taken from the last year's Kidney Week. If you look into it, the first trials looking at the sugar control of these flozins are these, the blue ones. Then came the cardiovascular safety trials for the drugs as mandated by FDA. These are the ones. The latest to come out is Soloist, which came out last month in NEJM. And then we have trials which have actually looked into chronic kidney disease patients. This is heartening because all the trials that I talked earlier, very few of them have had patients with low GFR in their cohort. So these are the trials. The SCORED along with Soloist came out last week or a week before NEJM. So these are the trials on SGLT2/1. And the mechanism of SGLT2/1 is when you're hyperglycemic, you filter a lot more of sugars. These sugars in patients of diabetics have actually an upregulated sodium glucose transporter 2. These drugs in the renal proximal tubule inhibit SGLT2, and hence the sugar along with sodium is not absorbed and sugar is excreted out in the urine. And this is the transporter in the proximal tubule. This leads to an increased excretion of sodium and glucose and also uric acid secretion. Now this serendipitously leads to a high increased delivery of sodium and chloride in the macula densa, leading to the vasoconstriction of afferent arteriole. This leads to reduction in the glomerular pressure and hence its renoprotection. So these drugs not only cause loss of reduction in plasma glucose, but because of loss of this carbohydrate leads to body weight reduction. Because of loss of sodium excretion, natriuresis, blood pressure, lower uric acid, and finally glomerular filtration. This benefit of these drugs is actually the keystone for its renoprotection. So besides this delivery, it also in the macula densa, because of its altered tubuloglomerular, preserved tubuloglomerular feedback, there is a reduction in tubuloglomerular feedback, leads to intraglomerular pressure and proteinuria. The earliest trials, where SGLT2/1 was used to look into kidney and cardiovascular, actually looked into these 4 parameters: the major adverse cardiovascular event, colloquially the coronary artery disease, the atherosclerotic disease, heart failure, cardiovascular death, and CKD progression. It's quite easy if you look at EMPIREC, CANVAS, DECLARE, TIMI, CREDENCE, and VERTIS. The maximum benefit was seen in patients with heart failure and CKD progression. CKD progression almost showed a change in about 40% risk reduction. The first trial, this again presented in the CREDENCE trial, was presented in the World Congress of Nephrology in 2019, a trial which showed that in patients with type 2 diabetes and kidney disease, they used a GFR up to 30 ml. The risk of kidney failure and cardiovascular events was much, much lower in the canagliflozin group and the placebo group. This led to a lot of excitement and led to the use of this drug. There's a visual abstract of CREDENCE where almost 4,400 people were recruited and they were given plus randomized. Patients who are on the maximum tolerated ACE and ARB randomized to placebo and canagliflozin. If you look into it, the primary outcome, renal outcomes, there was a hazard ratio of 0.7, a 30% reduction, and heart failure also showing a very salutary reduction in cardiovascular endpoints also. Then came the DAPA CKD trial, which was published last year, I think in October, NEJM. The importance of this trial is this not only took patients with diabetic, so 2/3 of the patients were diabetic kidney disease, but they had patients who were chronic kidney disease, non-diabetic, like IgA nephropathies, minimal change disease, a few lupus nephritis, that group of patients. And DAPA-CKD almost mimicked the results of CREDENS and showed that there was a 39% risk reduction in the endpoint of declining eGFR, ESKD, renal or CV. These were the primary endpoints. A 44% reduction in the renal composite endpoints, that is sustained decline in GFR, ESKD or renal death. 30% reduction in CV death, and overall 31% all-cause mortality. This drug actually shows a much higher improvement in CV death compared to EMPA-KIDNEY, not EMPA-KIDNEY, the Emperor's Code study, which came out a little later. So consistent treatment effect in patients with CKD across major subgroups, in patients with T-type diabetes, the type of baseline GFR, the type of USR, was well tolerated and showed significant benefit. So all these trials, the SGLT2 trials, actually used various CKD patients, not just G1, G2 or 3A. The CREDENS used up to a GFR of 30. So they had patients in both 3A and 3B, whereas DAPA-KIDNEY went down a little more and had included patients up to a GFR of 25 ml. So we have patients of CKD stage 4 and CKD stage 3B in these studies. These drugs also have adverse effects. They have some amount of hypoglycemia in about 18% of patients. Ketoacidosis is noted. This is because of hypovolemia. So they need to be adequately hydrated when they are in these good drugs. And there are other hypovolemic issues like hypotension, postural dizziness, AKI also I'll discuss a little later. Urinary tract infections in the earlier studies, the Carnegie-Flozin studies, where we were part of a trial, the earliest Canvas study showed a high risk of mycotic genital infections, but this has not been shown now. Maybe our hygiene has improved, or maybe we hydrate ourselves more in these recent studies. Acute kidney injury has been shown. There is a risk of almost, in certain studies, the Canvas, the earlier Canvas showed of 1/3, 33% or 34% risk of acute kidney injury. But the newer ones, CREDENS, are about 15%, and DAPA-CKD, not much. So it is important to keep them adequately hydrated when we are using the SGLT2 inhibitors. Now, the benefit risk for these drugs is that it reduces cardiovascular coronary artery disease to about 10%, CV death about 15%, 30% heart failure, 30 to 40% CKD. AKI, it does not, it sometimes worsens it, but there are risks of hypoglycemia, decay, volume depletion, and further amputations and fractures also, which has been noted. This is a KDIGO study. It's a very busy study. I will leave it to you to go through it, but it has come out in CJAS and it is going to come out. So patients with type 2 diabetes, CKD, and a GFR of more than 30 ml should be started with SGLT2 inhibitors. And the drugs which we have in our country is Carnegie-Flozin, start with 100 milligram, DAPA 10, and EMPA also 10 milligram. These patients have to be told about sick day care, perioperative care, foot care, basic hygiene, and monitor. If patients have, we also need to talk about them about hypoglycemia and various issues about volume depletion. We come to a group of drugs which came a little earlier, maybe 4 or 5 years before the SGLT2 inhibitors, the incretins. They actually help us in, they sort of, this GLP-1 stimulates insulin releases. So their action starts when you start eating actually. So they are drugs which are on-demand kind of a drugs, which they sort of release insulin or inhibit glucagon. Two groups of drugs are there, the incretins, the GLP-1 and GIP, and the DPP-4 inhibitors. Drugs that we have in GLP-1 are the dulaglutide. In India, we have dulaglutide. We have liraglutide in India, and I think semaglutide is also this. Unfortunately, most of them are injections, and they need to be, the advantage is you can use them in some of these groups once a week also. How does incretins help in our renal protection? These drugs actually, of course, reduce hyperglycemia and help retardation of kidney disease. But there is a whole lot of anti-inflammatory action of this group of drugs. They reduce the cytokine release and growth factors and may benefit in improving the inflammatory pathway of pathogenesis of diabetic kidney disease. Because of their weight loss, they cause significant weight loss, the metabolic syndrome improves, and that has a benefit on diabetic kidney disease. Improves systemic hypertension and also has been shown to reduce glomerular hypertension. So the pleiotropic effects of this group is reduces the body weight, reduces CRP, reduces fat content, has some amount of antihypertensive effect, reduces inflammation, and so dyslipidemia. I'll come back to about this group of drugs into when we discuss cardiovascular comorbidities. And we understand these drugs, as will be shown, have much more beneficial effect in the group of patients who have atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. So the KDIGO tells us to start with SGLT2, which we did with our patients, because most of our patients, the chronic kidney disease patients, actually have heart failure at the later stages and arrhythmias rather than significant coronary artery disease. So the incretin drugs, this drug, the AWARD-7 study, which had shown that there is a slight benefit with dulaglutide 0.75 and 1.5 milligram as a renal protection, but not as profound or as remarkable with SGLT2 inhibitors. This is a study which has been published where they have looked into it in 2017. Yes, liraglutide to a certain extent can improve your GFR and can retard your CKD progression. So these are the group of drugs where we can use who's good for what. For cardiovascular benefits, the GLP-1 is good, DPPOs are not that good. For heart failure, SGLT2s are much better. For proteinuria reduction, both SGLT2 and GLP-1 have shown benefits. GFR loss, there are studies to show significant improvement in the GFR. But then each one of them have its side effects, infection, ketoacidosis. Here we can have nausea, vomiting, and some of this DP4 can worsen your heart failure. So even though our patient was started on SGLT inhibitors, we were aware that he may not be able to use it. So we need to understand what are the areas that we want to look into it. SGLT2 inhibitors, unfortunately, are not potent hypoglycemic agents. So if you want to really cut down your sugars, then you need to go to insulin or go to the GLP antagonist. If your patient has a very high risk of atherosclerotic heart disease, GLP. Then if you have patients whose GFR has come down to less than 15 milli, you cannot use GLP or SGLT2, but you can use DPP4 insulin also. Drug cost, low cost, of course, sulfonylureas, but we have to be worried about its hypoglycemic, profound long-term hypoglycemia. You want to avoid injections, don't take GLP, some of them, but take tablets and try to manage. So these are the ways you can look into it and decide on what drugs, depending on your patient's preference, its side effects, and the comorbidities of your patients. So if you want to treat a patient, first of course, lifestyle, therapy, diet, weight loss, start with metformin. If it helps you, you can continue. If it does not help, you can start SGLT2, but not in GFR less than 30. DAPA-CKD can take you to 25, but the guidance is still not come. If that does not help, consider the GLP-2 1 receptor antagonist. Then over a period of time, DP4, insulin. These drugs, sulfonylurea because of its profound hypoglycemic effect, thiazolidinediones because of their water retention, and alpha-glucosidase because of the GI drugs, drug effects. I have not been, and many of us don't use them. We do use sulfonylureas, but our choice is metformin, SGLT2, or metformin, DPP4, and if patient can afford, GLP-1 receptor agonist. Control of diabetes and hypertension does not end unless we say a few words about its comorbidities. The cardiovascular comorbidities in our patient is predominantly now being recognized as heart failure rather than coronary artery disease. In fact, patients with coronary artery disease do not survive to come to CKD stage 4 or stage 5. There is a selection of them. So most of our patients, when they come to stage 4, stage 5, are actually our patients with LVH, dilated heart with arrhythmias. Now, briefly, I'll discuss about hyperuricemia and a little bit of cholesterol. But no comorbidity reduction happens unless we restrict salt. And there is tremendous evidence to reduce salt intake to improve hypertension. But there is only moderate evidence that salt restriction reduces cardiovascular disease or stroke, and very weak evidence for reduction in chronic kidney disease. But we still ask our patients to reduce salt because of its salutary effect on blood pressure control. The cardiovascular comorbidities now again go back to these group of drugs, as you realized, are being shown to not only being renoprotective but cardiovascular risk. We actually, clinical acumen tells you which is the drug which we should use, but most of us, when we are in trouble, we go back to this ACC-AHA, atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk calculator. These are available in the computer. You just need to put the data, the demographics and the patient's data, and you get a risk. Our patient, the first one, 45-year-old gentleman with lipids and smoker, has a 10-year risk of developing atherosclerotic coronary artery disease or stroke of about 25.9%. So this patient, even though because he's 45 years, there is insufficient evidence whether we should be starting antiplatelets, because we all worry because of the gastritis in our patients. Sometimes aspirin, many of our patients don't tolerate, but then he needs to have high intensity statin, and he should be on ACE inhibitors, which he is actually on. Please notice there is no mention of beta blockers. If at all you need to add, if this doesn't work, we can use calcium channel blockers. And we discussed about calcium channel blockers, the non-nifedipine ones, which can also benefit in our patients with proteinuria. But then there is another calculator which you need to look, because our patients, most of us, as we said, we don't worry much about coronary artery disease. There was a time when we used to do angiogram for many of our diabetic. Over a period of time, my student has done a thesis. Less than 15% of our CKD patients have significant remediable coronary artery disease. So we need to look, and the same patient, when we input his data, we realize he has a 7.7 one-year mortality because of heart failure. Because of, you remember his ejection fraction was 45% and has a 19.1-year mortality. So this patient, which is the cardiovascular risk we are worried about? Is it atherosclerotic heart disease or heart failure? The first study to look into it is the EMPA-REG study, which came in 2015. And the editorial which accompanied NEJM actually said, this flozin, the empagliflozin, is not an anti-diabetic medicine, but should be used by cardiologists. It's a drug for the heart. But if you look into it, if you look into the primary outcome of atherosclerotic coronary artery disease, the benefit was not much. But if you look into the heart failure, there was significant reduction in the heart failure risk of 0.65, 35% reduction with empagliflozin. So my patient, I think it's good. We will continue SGLT2 inhibitors and will not think of the GLP-1. If clinically I felt that if he doesn't stop smoking, his atherosclerotic risk increases, then later we may think of adding a GLP-1. So this is the advantage now. We can use metformin to a certain till GFR of 30, and then we can add up an SGLT2 inhibitors, which we have done to our patient. Over the period of time, looking at his sugar control, hypertension, and his atherosclerotic profile, we may even consider adding GLP-1 agonist. Now, how does SGLT2 benefit? This is actually a benefit which has been looked, as we discussed, not only throw out sugar, we also throw out salt. So the urine of a patient who has been fluorinated is actually salty and sweet. And this leads to hemodynamic benefits in volume, metabolism, and sodium changes. And there are lots of benefits. Arrhythmia is reduced, the volume preload, afterload is reduced, the cardiac efficiency improves, the arterial wall integrity because of salt improves, and there are a lot of things. So EMPA-REG actually postulated, because of its use of reduction of both salt and sugar, this led to the various cardiac and renal protection. There are various other changes because of SGLT2 inhibitors in various parts of the body, not only in the kidney, in the heart, because of its reduced oxygen requirement. It reduces the metabolism in the heart, delivers more oxygen, reduces left ventricular mass. So it has benefits in various parts of the body, like the brain, neuroprotection, improved erythropoiesis, improved anemia in our patients. So SGLT2 inhibition has pleiotropic effects. This is the last study that we had, that I would discuss, is the sotagliflozin in patients with diabetes and chronic kidney disease. This code, which came out last week, sotagliflozin is actually a SGLT2 and a SGLT2 inhibitors, 1 and 2. The 1 is in the gut, where it prevents, it actually reduces absorption of salt and sugar from the gut itself. So there is a belief that the metabolic through the portal circulation of the sugar comes down, and it may benefit to a certain extent in the dyslipidemia and fatty liver. And this drug, this is a study from Harvard by Deepak Bhatt, which had shown that it also causes reduction in death because of cardiovascular causes, hospitalization, and urgent visits to hospital. I think I have taken a lot of time, so I will just end it with uric acid. Current studies, the PEARL and the CKD-FIX studies have shown that there is no benefit of lowering urate in patients with diabetic kidney disease. And there are many other targets are there. If you look into it, these whole list of them, most of them are on trials now. Pardaloxolone, paracalcitol, most of them are on trial, but clinically not available. Pirfenidone, robuxastorin, you can go through it, but they are not being used. So finally, what we understand is that we have a KDIGO guideline. What is important is we should have a comprehensive care of these patients, monitor their sugars, antihypertensive therapy, lifestyle, and take care of their benefits altogether. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. That's an excellent presentation, Dr. O'Meara. And I have one question before I allow other people to, the audience to ask questions. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, I can hear you. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you. I took a lot of time, sir. I think
no, it's okay.
I appreciate your patience to sit through so much of information, sir. That's the only thing.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so Dr. O'Meara, in our setting in Africa, it's very difficult to get DPP-4 and, for treatment of patients with end-stage renal disease, for example, a patient in stage 5, those who are on dialysis. Can we be allowed to use like metformin with other drugs like sulfonylureas in patients who are on hemodialysis? That's not, yes, that's number one. Number two, for patients who are not tensive with diabetic kidney disease, what the recommended dose of ARBs or ACE inhibitors, would you recommend in that particular patient? Maximum dose that you can go, so that you avoid the patient going to hypoglycemia.
Very, very, very interesting question. You asked for ACE and ARBs. The second question was about the recommended dose of ACE and ARBs, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
Yes. So, sir, I knew you, we are aware of it because even in our country, DPP-4 and SGLT2 ones are difficult to have. So I just reviewed my patient charts before I came. We have about 200, 225 patients on dialysis, of which about 40%, 50% are diabetics. We have only a single patient, 2 of them on sulfonylureas. And both of them are on short-acting sulfonylureas, glimepiride or gliclazide. Because majority of our patients don't eat well, so the sugar control has not been a major issue in our patients. Only if you look into the anti-correction of their hypoglycemia, of the 40% of our patients are on minimum doses of hypoglycemic agents, and majority of them are on short-acting insulin. Short-acting, we have kept it. because there are issues of hypoglycemia during dialysis. Only 2 patients are on sulfonylureas. None of them are on metformin. We find it very challenging to use metformin in GFR less than 15. Acidosis worsens, and patients' symptoms, the GI symptoms are very prominent. They don't somehow agree with metformin. So if it is required, I would suggest, I know it requires a little bit of patient persuasion, insulin is the best form in short-acting insulin or the short-acting sulfonylureas. The older ones, the other glibenclamides and all, we don't use. We have in our country and in our dialysis unit, glycoside and glimepiride. These 2 can be used and your patient can be taken care. And I'm sure Africa will have DPP-4 very soon, very soon. SGLT2 one. In our country now, DPP-4, some of the drugs, dapagliflozin costs, 1 tablet, 10 milligrams cost about 6 rupees. That is, a month's therapy is about 180 rupees, that is $2. $2 or $3 at the most. So I'm sure you will also get it. They will make a difference. They really add up to our control. The second question of normotensive patients with ACE inhibitors, isn't it, sir? That was the question. Yeah. So the basic pathophysiology of normotension is there is no upregulation of angiotensin. Angiotensin pathway, the RAS pathway, is a pathway of flight and fight. It is not a physiological pathway. It's only in various parts in the brain, in maintaining the kidney filtration. It is not upregulated. So you may give enalapril, you may give losartan, the blood pressure will not drop. In a majority of patients, because angiotensin is not activated. So blocking the angiotensin is not, the RAS system is not contributing much to the blood pressure rise. So using those drugs, the hypotension does not happen. I am aware of a doctor in nephrology who uses as much as the dose possible till the patient becomes symptomatically hypotensive. So I have a doctor, I know Lloyd knows him, Dr. M.K. Mani. He uses almost 40 milligrams of enalapril, 40 to 60 milligrams of enalapril in his patients to achieve optimum RAS blockade. So the dosage, you can start with low dose. I think you have enalapril. What we do is start with 5 milligrams. We have losartan. Losartan we use by 50 milligrams and we increase. Many of our patients, just for its antiproteinuric effect, does not actually cause hypotension to them. On the other hand, if you have proteinuria, if you have diabetic kidney disease, almost 90% of them have developed hypertension. So they will have hypertension. So rarely will you see a patient who's proteinuric and not hypertensive. But if you still have a patient who's proteinuric and you need to use the ACE inhibitors for its intraglomerular hypertension, you start with enalapril lowest dose, follow them up and increase. And these patients actually don't even have, we have not seen, I have used quite a few, my colleagues also use it in normotensive proteinuric diabetics, not many. And we have started with the low dose and we use the same principles of RAS blockade. Progressively monitor their creatinine, their blood pressure, and then go on increasing to the maximally tolerated dose. I hope it sort of answers your question, sir.
All right. Thank you very much, Urmila. That's very.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Yeah. So we can allow questions from the audience. Anyone with a question to Dr. Urmila?
Dr. Makwabe, if I may.
Yes, Amar, please.
So Dr. Urmila, the problem that I have seen is the initial spike of serum creatinine in patients who are initially initiated on SGLT2, and sometimes I think it's more concerning to them than it is to us. So in your experience, how do you go about telling these patients that this will settle down?
Yeah, doctor, I agree with you because SGLT2 is doing the same thing. It is reducing the glomerular filtration. Here you are blocking the efferent arteriole, the RAS people, you dilate the efferent arteriole. So it's the same what they do. And yes, we also see almost 20% of them having a rise in creatinine. And I did not have time to show, I will share the slide from the TAPA CKD study. people actually who have shown to have this blip of rising creatinine actually over the long time have shown much more renal protection. Similar to RAS blockade, the rising creatinine reflects that you have successfully reduced the glomerular pressure. And this is something when we use RAS blockade, and the same conversation, we educate the patient, tell them the side effects, this worsening creatinine. We also tell them the same thing, be alert that the creatinine may rise. It should not rise more than 30%. If it is more than 30%, we have to look for, the most important contribution is of course the reduction in the glomerular pressure. Second is these patients are hypovolemic. If the sugars are not controlled, they have diuresis going on, they are dry, so the creatinine rises much more in this group of patients. So aggressively hydrate them, tell them to maintain hydration, and look for their urine output and monitor the creatinine. And we have to encourage them. They are concerned, we are also concerned. This is the problem we faced with RAS blockade. And initially when we started RAS blockade, whenever the creatinine used to rise, we used to stop it. But I think we also need to go through the same experience now, convince them, tell them it is good that the creatinine rises, it stabilizes over a period of time, and this benefit is much more good in the long term.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
There is a chat question which is very interesting, diabetic nephropathy and... Bolu sir, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Hello.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Yes, please go ahead.
My name is Dr. Oswin from Bayer. So I have a question. So if you have the patient with diabetes, nephropathy with proteinuria, so at what EGFR you're not supposed to use a ACE inhibitor?
Actually, there is a very good study it just come out. I will share the article. I will ask Lloyd. RAS blockade in advanced CKD. In fact, it is your practice. There are a few things you need to look into it. What are the comorbidities in the patient? How bad is his cardiovascular comorbidity? What is his blood pressure control? Thirdly, what is his lifespan? And fourthly, how compliant is he with his diet? And what is his risk of hyperkalemia? How many times he's got hyperkalemia? You need to check these boxes. And we have actually used these drugs even in dialysis patients. We find it easier to use in CKD stage 5D also because these patients come for dialysis regularly. We use this group of drugs in patients in whom we believe that the hypertension is caused by the renin-angiotensin. I'm sure you also see in your practice that there are a group of patients who are dialyzed and during dialysis they have very high blood pressures. These are the group of patients who benefit with RAS blockade. So ACE inhibitors, we have not stopped using at any GFR. We use it till end stage, but we monitor the potassium. And we find it easier when the patient is on dialysis. Yes, we find it a little concern when the patient is CKD stage 5 and not on follow-up. In those patients, we are a little clinically concerned in your practice. But if the patient is on dialysis, even in dialysis, we use ACE inhibitors. We are actually part of an international multicentric trial from Canada called ACHIEVE that is looking into spironolactone in patients with heart failure, in dialysis with heart failure. And the study is now almost 3 years and they have shown very little risk of hyperkalemia with some significant benefit in cardiovascular morbidity. So ACE inhibitors till dialysis you can use because your patients are regularly coming back, but provided you know that this patient is regular, compliant, and does not have very bad comorbidities, which can cause hypotension and worsen his peripheral vascular disease or things like that. Stage 5, we are a little different, but little concerned, but we use it in all stages of our kidney disease. And the study which came out that ACE inhibitors in advanced chronic kidney disease also actually comments in saying that the benefit far outweighs the risks, and if there are not many adverse effects, we should continue it irrespective of the patient's GFR. We use it in stage 5 also.
Thank you. Thank you, Omira. That is a very good answer. Yeah, so, yes, Lloyd?
Well, the same thing, Urmila, one thing is, if a patient is closely followed up, you know, and
Yes.
you know that the patient is compliant with this potassium, there is no need to stop the ACE inhibitor and you're following him up.
Yeah,
But if a patient is non-compliant or you're losing the patient to follow up, in that sort of a situation, I think I would probably hold the ACE inhibitor.
Absolutely. We also do that. Stage 5, we get worried because we know the patient does not come back to us. And we do understand it's not only that, they have to be dietary compliant also. We had patients in Maharashtra when the seasonal mango is there, their potassiums used to be haywire because they will eat 2 mangoes every day, 3 mangoes every day. And we used to actually have seasonal disruption of ACE inhibitors. The mango season, we used to stop the ACE inhibitors. So there are much more practical issues to be sorted out rather than just the GFR. We need to understand our patients and decide which patients we should be using it rather than the GFR.
Chat question, the important chat.
Yeah, the chat question is term diabetic nephropathy and diabetic kidney disease differently defined. Yes. When we were student, it was diabetic nephropathy. And in simple terms, it was thought to be the disease in the kidney where the histopathology is classical diabetes. That is basement membrane thickening, mesangial expansion, mesangial matrix formation. The ISN RPS will classify this as the diabetic kidney disease stage 1, stage 2, stage 3, stage 4 with classical Kimmel-Still-Wilson disease. So how do we tell a patient is diabetic nephropathy? So our learning and our understanding was a patient who is diabetic, who's got proteinuria, who fits into the natural history of diabetes as Mogensen and others have described, and has diabetic retinopathy. So we used to believe that if you biopsy this patient, the patient will have a classical diabetic nephropathy changes. So we used to use the word diabetic nephropathy. We still use it. A patient with diabetic kidney and retinopathy. Now, diabetic kidney disease is a recent understanding because we all have understood that the kidney manifestations of diabetes is just not that classical changes as described before. The changes of basement membrane thickening, mesangial expansion, matrix deposition, the nodular glomerulosclerosis, that's not happening. There are biopsy series all over the world which have shown that almost 50% of diabetic kidney disease has various other changes. There are manifestations of hypertension, more so in African cohorts. There are manifestations of tubulointerstitial injury, which does not mimic that of diabetes. So it may not be, even the patient may have retinopathy, but his kidney may not be that of classical purist definition of diabetic nephropathy. And then we have patients with repetitive AKI, damaging, worsening creatinine because of use of ACE inhibitors and other drugs. So now we believe, instead of have the semantics of differentiating, we use the word diabetic kidney disease. But that means a whole lot of pathological changes in a patient with diabetes in his kidney, which can be because of diabetes, but various other factors, hemodynamics, inflammatory, various other changes, drug-induced, that changes in the kidney. My personal choice, if I have a diabetic kidney disease patient with a fundus showing retinopathy, we still say it has diabetic nephropathy because we don't biopsy them. But if a patient, we don't have that information, but we know this patient has worsening creatinine and albuminuria, we call it diabetic kidney disease. We also need to understand, if you look into the UKPDA study, almost 30% of the patient on follow-up had worsening creatinine without microalbuminuria. They had no proteinuria, but they had progressive reduction in GFR. So that is when the term of diabetic kidney disease started coming. So they don't behave like high sugars, microalbumin, macroalbumin, then worsening GFR. They seem to have, that cohort of patients from UK actually bypassed that proteinuric phase and straight went to a reduction of GFR. So there are groups of patients now who don't believe in the natural history of the classical diabetic nephropathy. So it's easier and simpler to use the word diabetic kidney disease. But if you have the information, if you have a biopsy which shows Camel-Still, Wilson, or if you have florid retinopathy, I think you will be right in saying that these patients have diabetic nephropathy. I think I've not confused people with this answer. That's anything.
That is an excellent point, Urmila. And your first, I think one of your first slides showed that. See, when you have a person who has diabetes and kidney disease, you look for diabetic nephropathy with retinopathy, but you should look for AKI. You should look for comorbid renal disease. You look for vascular disease. You look for hyperuricemia. You look at inflammation and tubular interstitial disease. That's what you said in your slide. And I'm just reading out what you said on your slide. And that's a very, very important and a very, very good slide that you put out. Thank you very much.
Yeah, because that's, and Lloyd, you know, many of us actually don't see the original diabetic nephropathy. We see most of those things and we miss those things. So I think it's important. Unfortunately, it was more on diabetic nephropathy, but the clinical practice is way beyond all this. There was a chat question, how do we manage hypoaldosteronism with spontaneous hyperkalemia? That's a very difficult question. We obviously don't use RAS inhibitors. We don't use MRAs. We don't use beta blockers because the RAS blockade, there is a hypoaldosteronism. These kind of patients we manage with diuretics and we manage with calcium channel blockers. We prefer non-dihydropyridine. Amlodipine also we can use, but we prefer to use diltiazem verapamil. But most of us use calcium channel blockers in this group of patients to control their hypertension and to a certain extent their proteinuria. And I think now we may be using SGLT2/1, but then SGLT2/1 also, I didn't mention, causes hyperkalemia. We have seen in our patients having hyperkalemia, not much, about a couple, we have in our follow-up more than 100 patients on SGLT2/1 inhibition with our endocrinologist. We have 2-3 patients with hyperkalemia for whom we have to withdraw the drugs. So it's important that blood pressure control is just not RAS blockade, but we can consider CCBs, and the diuretics help us in correcting the hyperkalemia to a certain extent. But diuretics have not shown to be beneficial for proteinuria.
Okay, thank you very much for the very good answers.
It's a pleasure to be with you all. Thank you. And I must thank Lloyd to give me this opportunity. I mean, it's so nice to interact with all of you.
Thank you very much, Urmila. We thank you. You know, we should thank you because, you know, you have ceased all your important activities and joined us. So we really appreciate for your time, Urmila.
Thank you very much.
And next time, I think we'll request you again to come back again and share your knowledge with us.
Oh, I will love to. I've told Lloyd whenever he wants, he just has to give me a week's time because we are so busy clinicians. We need to read up things. And I know the information, even the next day tomorrow you will see newer information on what I have talked about. Everything changes every week. That's the only thing.
Sure. Urmila, thank you very much. So
thank you.
we have come to an end of today's session. So we'll see you next week, same time. Thank you for joining, and thank you, Urmila,
thank you,
and Lloyd and AHN for organizing this session. Thank you.
Thanks very much.